We're going to get started. So I think a few people are still cruising in with their waters and chai, but we'll get started so we can stay on schedule. My name is Tim Kern. If you don't know me, I'm the director of the Adnan Center. I'm also the chair and director of the secondary education program here at California, largest state of California. Right on. Go teach, as they say. So I'm in the College of Education. I'm going to make a few logistical announcements at the beginning of our program. We are asking everybody to mask up, so while we're inside, not eating. I'm also going to ask everybody to silence their mobiles and cell phones. Indeed, I need to remind myself about that. That would be embarrassing. Restrooms. Many people have asked me. Around the out left, they're over here. And lastly, I'm just going to give you a little bit of the agenda. I'm going to say a few words of welcome, thanks, introduce some folks, get the pleasure of introducing our distinguished speaker, Farhad Manjoo. And I'm going to let Farhad speak for, what are you going to speak? It's 45-ish, right? And then we'll have a Q&A after that. So we'll hold the questions until he's finished with his presentation. So first and foremost, let me thank you and welcome you to the 22nd annual Solanki lecture in person, I might add. And I don't know about you all, but I'm super happy to see people in 3 dimensions. I saw my old friend Don Robinson. I haven't seen Don except on a Zoom screen for a couple of years, so it's really good to see people in 3D. And nothing against there are people watching us online as well. Nothing against you folks. But it's really a pleasure to have people here in person. And like all of us, COVID has really warped and completely distorted my sense of all of us nodding. But it's been 2 years since we had to suddenly cancel the Solanki lecture in the wake of what I call the Great Disruption that took place in March 2020. And in fact, we then postponed that Solanki lecture. And okay, nothing to worry about. That's supposed to happen. Anyway, and then we postponed it, and we had a Zoom Solanki lecture in 2021. So I'm very tired of Zoom, right? And I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we're sort of moving into a sort of endemic period as opposed to a pandemic one. And Mahir and I are very hopeful that most of our programming next year will get off the Zoom and come back to being face-to-face and on campus and back to that kind of pre-COVID time and space. So let me talk a little bit about what the center's been up to over the past few years. And after I've told you about how tired I am of Zoom, I would point out that Zoom was our lifeline over the past 2 years. And it allowed us to keep up programming, right, through Zoom, both large programs, small programs. And we were actually able to have speakers both in the United States. We also had speakers who were early risers and willing to get up at 6 a.m. in India, right, to be on Zooms with us here. So that was something that was, I thought, really great, right? So we had a number of book discussions in the past 2 years, and we also had conversations with speakers about Sikh communities in the Central Valley, the deployment of yoga and contemporary festivals in the West. We had 2 talks on COVID in India during the 2-year period. We had a talk on the comparative state of higher education in India and the United States, in particular, how this higher education had been impacted by the pandemic. We had a talk on the intersecting histories of computing and modern art, post-independent Bombay, and more recently, a really interesting discussion with Tanvi Madan from the Brookings Institute, where she talked to us about India's response to the Russian invasion and war in Ukraine. Very timely topic. I'd also point out that this year, starting in the fall of 2021, the Adnan Center, with the generous support of the Solanki Foundation, has started another Solanki Teacher Scholar Program, providing monthly workshops and reading circles addressing the early modern and modern history of India for 30 AP World History teachers across the country who are teacher leaders in the field, a really extraordinary group of folks. They're going to be like a seminar, right? They have speakers, we have workshops, book club, and they're going to be producing curriculum for teachers across that will be open source on the Adnan and Center web. In fact, tomorrow we have a book club meeting. One of our teachers here. I haven't finished the book. You've all been in book club, right? Don't worry, finished. Actually, I've read it. I'll reread. But anyway, so before introducing our speaker, I'd like to thank you folks. First, I'd like to thank Jeet Joshi, the Vice President of International Education, and Anna Cortez. Is Anna around? Hiding in the back. Anna, you going to come out and say hello? Oh, she's running the camera. Okay. Jeet, you can. There's Anna. Let's give Anna a big hand. And Jeet Joshi. Jeet, you want to stand up? This is the house that Jeet built. And we really like our new digs here. I don't know about you folks, but I really like the space, having the outside area better than the point of use. Hopefully we will be good tenants, you guys. Second, I'd like to thank our caterers, right? Small Palace Restaurant. Give them your business. Om Kakari. And I want to thank them again for being on time. Always society. This where the caterer was. We also want to thank Vaishali Chowdhury, Center Student Assistant and Social Media Whiz. Come on in. Don't be shy, right? And Vaishali just is graduating in May with a degree in International Studies here at Cal State Long Beach. And she is headed to Georgetown School of Law this summer. We'll all be working for you someday. And I really want to thank Dr. Mihir Pandya. Mihir, stand up. From the Department of Anthropology, he's the Associate Director of the Center. He's going to be facilitating the Q&A tonight after we finish speaking. And he's done the lion's share of making this happen. Thank you as always. Lastly, and most importantly, though, I'd like to thank Nalini Solanki and her now multi-generations of families. This is the first time we've had the grandkids of the Solankis at a Solanki lecture, right? And it's the Solanki family, it's their generous donation from the Uka and Nalini Foundation that created the center and has made this and all the events aforementioned. Standing up. Thank you. Come on, David. Thank you. And lastly, and on a personal note, I just want to say how the Solanki lecture means a lot to me, the way, me at least, I was telling this to Nalini, kind of surface, remember the joyful and enthusiastic life here at Uka Solanki we lost over. And so now let me introduce our speaker, Farhad Manjoo. Farhad was born in Pretoria, South Africa, right? And his parents moved to Southern California. He's a SoCal kid, right? He was 8 years old, and he went to John F. Kennedy High School right over here in Buena Park, telling us about how inspired he was by his history teachers there. Thank you. Hope that was true. Yeah, excellent. Okay, because we trained a lot of those teachers, right? And then he went on to Cornell University, where they earned their BA. Farhad is a well-known and influential columnist. A lot of people Department of Journalism tonight coming. And he started off as a staff writer at Slate from 2008 to 2013 before becoming the technology columnist for the Wall Street Journal before taking the same position for the New York Times, right? In 2018, Farhad, and I think you would say this was a promotion, was promoted to becoming an opinion columnist for the New York Times, writing not only about tech, but also global politics, culture. But we had a really interesting conversation about what it means to have to write something every week that then is open to the criticism of the New York Times readership for the next 6 days. Well done. And today I just read his piece, a very illuminating and disturbing column on the increasing dangers of walking bicycles. Now, you've probably heard Farhad speaking on NPR from time to time, and they also published True Enough, Learning to Live in a Post-Fact World in 2008, that Farhad claims, and I'm quoting you here, accurately predicted our modern age of tech-abated echo chambers and alternative facts, which is so true in the world. Personal note, did not remember that Farhad was the author of this, but he wrote a piece called Space Invaders, Why You Should Never Ever Use Spaces After Period. The thing called Slate. Has anybody read that? Oh, it had a tremendous impact on me. I was completely convinced by the argument, but I still do it. Anyway. So Farhad's talk tonight is entitled Tech in the Burning World, and I can only imagine all the timely developments that might be encompassed with the title. I think we can think about the seen and unforeseen technological impact of the pandemic, about the efficacy of drones in Ukraine. Also, God forbid, think about Elon Musk, Twitter. Any event, it's going to be a stimulating talk. There are lots of things to talk about. We look forward to your talk. Let us welcome Farhad Manjoo. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. And you're mic'd up.
Yes, I am. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for hi. Thanks so much for being here. I am really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about my favorite subject, which, roughly speaking, is the end of the world. I'm kidding, mostly kidding. The world probably won't end anytime soon, I think. Less sure of that now than I was a few months ago before we started talking about nuclear war. But even if the world doesn't end, I think we're in for some rough times. And I think technology is a big part of this. I mean, very rough. I mean, like war and fire and brimstone, storms unleashed from the heavens, and having to talk about Elon Musk all the time. Just very scary future. I say this as a longtime professional observer of the future. It's my job to think about the future, and I spent the last 2 decades covering the technology industry. And when I started, it was this nerdy little outpost on the West Coast. The tech industry didn't dominate culture. It wasn't winning Academy Awards. It didn't dominate politics. It wasn't undermining democracy. This was before the iPhone. It was before the iPod. It was several years before Netflix started up, and Netflix was only a DVD service when it started up. They sent you discs in the mail, so this was a long time ago. But I wanted to be where I thought the future was happening. So in college, I decided that after college, I wanted to be in the San Francisco Bay Area, Silicon Valley. I wanted to be in sort of the thick of see how the future got made. Until then, in college, I had 2 passions. I really liked computers, and I really liked the idea of telling people that they're wrong and why they're wrong. I'm an opinion columnist. And so let's go through both of them. So when I was a kid, my parents bought a Sinclair computer. It's a little typewriter-like thing that you connected to your TV. This was in the early 1980s. And to load programs on it, you hooked it up to like an actual tape player, set tape, kind you get Depeche Mode singles on in the 1980s. But they had computer programs on them, and then you somehow got the program onto the computer, and you could like do things. On this computer, one of the things you could do was write tiny little programs. The programming language was called BASIC. That was the name, BASIC. And it was so easy, a kid could learn it. I was 7, 8. I remember reading sample programs and then typing them into the computer. And then I remember the magic of having the computer do something that you asked. And for me, from that moment, I was under 10 years old, I was just really hooked. It really seemed to me like these machines could do anything. And I wanted to be there, helping them do so, covering how they did so. More backstory. And why I'm telling you all this will make sense in a bit, I think. The computer we had, the Sinclair, it was a British-made machine. It was from a company in the UK. And it was the only computer we could buy at the time, because at the time, I lived in South Africa. South Africa in the 1980s, at the apex of a system known as apartheid. So apartheid was this political system and kind of social philosophy that held that societies work best when people of different races are separated. And, oh yeah, that societies work best when white people are in charge. And in South Africa, it was a very specific kind of white person. It was a person of Dutch descent, an Afrikaner. It was that kind of white person was at the top of the pyramid. Apartheid held that person as kind of the leader of everyone else. And so maybe you can tell I am not a person of Dutch descent. It's not just the skin color, it's the height. The Dutch are the tallest people in the world. I am not. So I was a kid and I didn't really understand any of this. I knew about apartheid. I lived in that system. Like I'd heard the word. I didn't really kind of understand the concept or how it was affecting my life. In South Africa at the time, there were a few basic categories of race. There was white. Europeans had come to Africa hundreds of years ago. And in South Africa, after gold and diamond mines were discovered there was essentially like a colonial war between the Dutch and the British over who would rule the land. And in 1948, the Dutch party took over and they imposed apartheid. White people were about 10% of the population then. Then there were the native African people, black people, and they were made up of many different ethnicities and languages. There are lots of languages in South Africa. And they were about 80% of the population. And then the last 10% or so was the bucket I was in. So South Asians had come to Africa in the 1800s. They were agricultural workers and they were business people. You know, they were like immigrant drivers. Not different from probably many of the immigrant drivers you know today. Members of my family can trace their ancestry in Africa back that far, the 1800s. My parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents were born in Africa. And there are a few million Indians in South Africa. I was actually born in Durban, not Pretoria, but Durban is on the East Coast, and that's where the highest population of Indians are in South Africa. You may have read about it in the news recently. They had like terrible flooding there. And they've had kind of a lot of social and political problems recently. Slightly larger than the population of Indians was the population of what are still called in South Africa, colored people. And these were various kinds of mixed race people. I think the most famous South African colored person in America is Trevor Noah, for example. And so I was born into the society that was tremendously concerned with race. It was tremendously concerned with in-groups and out-groups and how you behaved and how you fit into these groups. And race was just something you thought about all the time. It defined your life. We lived in an Indian area. That is a place like demarcated for where Indians could buy property. We went to Indian schools where our teachers were Indian and all of the students were Indian, but where the language we were forced to learn was Afrikaans. But that was just law. My parents are impulsive people and they sort of jump into things. And so in the mid-1980s, they decided that they wanted to leave South Africa. Australia was their first choice, but we couldn't find a legal way to get in there. My dad is a pharmacist, and we learned that pharmacists were in high demand in the United States. They still are, by the way. If you want a good, steady job that will always be in demand, become a pharmacist. Don't become a journalist. That's what I tell my kids. But so having never been to Los Angeles before, never been to California, my parents in 1987 decided, we're moving there. We sold up all our stuff, and we left our family behind. The four of us, my mom and dad and my younger sister. We got on a plane. We landed at LAX in the spring of 1987, and that was our new life. I bring all of this up for a few reasons. First, of course, immigrating has been the defining sort of act part of my life. In a single stroke, it entirely changed my future. This seems obvious. Of course, coming to a new country would be a big deal. But I'm often struck by how people who aren't immigrants don't consider like the hugeness of immigration to how an immigrant thinks about the world. Like, it's not just that you've moved to a new place, it's more like you've gone to an altered dimension. It shapes you in all these subtle ways, in ways you don't foresee, in ways that seem small but turn out to be huge. One of the things immigration forces you to understand is this very basic thing about society. This fundamental idea that I think many people who are not immigrants never notice about the world. It's so kind of fundamental and basic that when I tell it to you, I should do kind of like the opposite of whatever the opposite of a drum roll is, because it's going to sound very banal. And that very basic thing is people are different. Also, people are the same. In some ways, people in one place are just like people in another place. In some ways, people are just shockingly different from people in other places. Thank you for attending my TED Talk. But seriously, you think this is obvious, but even so if you're not an immigrant, I bet what you're thinking is something along the lines of, yes, I'm inclusive, I believe in diversity, I think everyone has something to contribute, things like that. But that's not what I mean. I mean, I believe that. That's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is that if you lived in two different places, two different parts of the world, or maybe just two different parts of North America, I think you study with much greater precision the similar and different ways people behave and decide and think and based on where they live. I think you do this more than non-immigrants. Probably first-generation Americans have some of this too, but I suspect if you've actually lived in two different places, you notice this very strongly. But then, as you begin to notice all these big differences and all these similarities, this leads you to an even more profound epiphany. What are people? If people in some places are so shockingly different from people in other places, this seems to imply that people are both quite predictable and quite unpredictable. But that doesn't really mean anything. Why should place have such a powerful effect in how people act in some ways, but place have very little effect in how people act in other ways? And what is it about place that so collectively shaped how these people think about the world on issue X, but didn't really seem to matter to the outcome of issue Y? Some of it is just like surface level stuff. Like, boy, Americans really love the outdoors. That's not true. Maybe Californians really love the outdoors. What is it with people in California and going outdoors? Where I'm from, in South Africa, hiking is not a thing. It's not even like an idea. You're telling me you're going to go for a long walk outside to nowhere, and then you're just going to come back here? Why would you do that? Or in South Africa, people have just a totally different index of risk. When I go to South Africa and ride in someone's car and put my seatbelt on, they take it as an insult, like I'm telling them they're a bad driver. When I was a kid, we went to a place called Lion Park, kind of like SeaWorld for lions. And what happens is you drive through this huge Serengeti, this plain, and you see lions from your car. I was a toddler, I sort of kind of remember this, but as my mom tells the story, we were going through the park, and somewhere in the middle, like the worst place possible, we had car trouble, and our car was stuck. And there we were in a park full of lions. And what did we do? Nothing. The lions climbed around the car, and then after a couple of hours, another car came by, and then they drove to the ranger who sent someone to jumpstart our car, and we made it out of Lion Park. That's just life there. Sometimes you're stuck in Lion Park. Sometimes you die in a car crash. The last time we went before COVID, I went with my kids to a snake park. That's like SeaWorld for snakes. And the woman who was showing us these snakes, These snakes were in this like very flimsy glass containers. And she was pointing out this one, I think it was a mamba, and she said, "It's very poisonous, and we don't have the antidote." She looked specifically at my kids and said, "If it bites you, it's bye-bye to you." And then she laughed because this was very funny to her, dying of a snake bite. While I'm thinking, very Americanly, why don't you just get some antidote? Nobody I know in South Africa really took COVID very seriously. Maybe they'd wear a mask, but they'd take it off, smoke in the house. So as a kid, I was aware of all of these differences. Just on this, you're like, I felt like as an immigrant, I was hyper attuned to notice these subtle differences between people in one place and people in another. But for me, things were even more complicated because, remember, I'm an immigrant descended from other immigrants. And so I have all these separate, smaller subgroups. So I'm South Asian, but I'm not from the Indian subcontinent. I'm Gujarati, but what does that mean? It means that's the language my mom speaks to her mom. For a lot of other people, that's a deep identity. For me, it's a language. I'm Muslim. The Arabs invaded the subcontinent. That's how that happened. What does that mean for me? It means that my family eats at Pakistani restaurants. My parents, in all their wisdom, decided to give me a fashionable Muslim name in South Africa at the time, Farhad, which turns out actually to be a Persian name. And so every person from Iran that I've ever met thinks I'm from there and that I speak Farsi. I get email in Farsi all the time. All of this didn't strike me at once, but I didn't think about all of this till much later in life. But I think being an immigrant shaped how I grew up and how I think today about the world and about technology in a very deep way. When you have this epiphany that there are actually these many different intersecting sets of people in the world, and that how you behave is in some ways a function of these sets that you belong to, when you notice that there are all these teams and memberships that really make an impact in your life, you have a choice. And your choice is, you could choose one of the teams, play hard for one of those teams, or you can realize that teams are kind of BS. Like, if your place and upbringing and social connections affect how people act and to such a great degree, and it does so unpredictably, what does that mean for any of the beliefs and ideas and thoughts that you have? How did you come by them? Are they valid? Do you believe them just because other people around you? Do you believe them, like, would you have other belief if you just happen to grow up somewhere else? And then if that's the case, why should you trust your belief? I don't think every immigrant has this series of thoughts. I know a lot of immigrants who see these differences and decide only more strongly that this arbitrariness of belief should bolster their own ideas. But for me, maybe it was the age I was when I came, or maybe it was the dynamic between the place I'd come from and the place I'd come to. For whatever reason, immigration engendered in me this willingness to accept that other people's beliefs and ideas were just as valid as my own, or I should say, just as invalid, like similarly without validity, that all of our ideas were shaped by essentially this arbitrary variable. And so I won't say that I was thinking all of this, any of this, in 1992 when I first got on Prodigy, or in 1993 when I got on AOL, or late in 1994 when I first got on the World Wide Web, and my future was changed forever. I was 14. I was not thinking about any of it. But when I got on the internet, when I got on the World Wide Web, I understood the implications of this fantastical thing, this constantly growing network, this system that allowed anyone to connect with anyone else kind of computationally, allowing people and computers to get things done together from afar. And at some point, I had this thought, here is the thing. Here is the tool that will make all of us think and behave and kind of get a sense of what it is like to be an immigrant. if this takes off, if this becomes the hit I think it could be, maybe this could give everyone the feeling that I have been feeling, that not to believe in these categories or labels, that you can choose labels for your own, and that labels that were sort of defined by where you were could be unrelated to what you actually thought. To me, this was the great promise of the internet. Everyone would get online. Everyone would realize that they were no longer tied to place. That when you're no longer tied to place, constrained by place, they would understand kind of the beauty and the magic of human complexity. And the internet would allow us to communicate with one another. And maybe we'd build entire worlds online. And groups made up of people from all the geographic points in the world could come together and, be very happy. Like naive, dreamy, the ravings of a tech-drunk, nerdy teen. But, it was exciting. You could go online and you can find your people. In 1995, I was a junior in high school and then a senior in high school. And I got really into the band Smashing Pumpkins. And then I found online a huge community of others into the band who were also into the band. And through this community, just a simple bulletin board, I felt like I was getting even more into Smash. It deepened my attachment to the band because for me, the band was no longer just these 4 members. It was also all these other people online that I was constantly talking to. And then I started going to concerts and making friends with other strangers. I think I went to 6 Smashing Pumpkins concerts. And overnight, I became like the most embarrassing kind of group because of the internet. The internet was very powerful. And every year, it kept getting more powerful. More people on it, more people coming up with these ideas, more people to try out these ideas going from nothing to everything in a matter of weeks. I was in college in the late 1990s when this little Windows program came out that allowed you to get essentially any song ever recorded. It was called Napster. If you never used it, you might think it's a little like what streaming services are today. It was that, but it's also a little bit like what Facebook is, in that you could get a song from someone, but then you could also see all the other songs that they had, and then you could get those songs too. And it showed you kind of the other songs of the people who had that song. And then there were bootlegs on it. There were recordings of every concert. You could just kind of get anything ever recorded. Those were heady times. Napster was one of the quintessential online things where it made me think that this would be, the internet would be transformative for the world in a big way. People on the internet were coming together and kind of like sticking a middle finger up at the rest of the world who had not yet discovered this enlightened digital nirvana. This was a thing then. People online, people of the internet, that was a group. The internet was thousands of people, and then millions of people, and then tens of millions of people, but it was still small. It was not everyone. But even this tiny group, it was undermining this non-digital world in such profound ways. The music industry had this silly idea that sounds could be made scarce and sounds could be property. And the internet kind of mocked that idea. Sounds weren't property. They were just a string of numbers. And how could you strap down like a string of numbers? It just seemed impossible. Then there was the borderless. When my family and I first moved to the United States in 1986, talking to people in South Africa was like a very expensive and staticky affair. Lots of shouting into the phone. Now, my kids superimpose cow faces on their iPads, and my cousin's kids on the other side of the world like howl in laughter just immediately. In much smaller ways, you felt this even back then too. I was in Orange, back to the Smashing Pumpkins, I was in Orange County in 1997, and I heard one of the first streaming things I ever heard was a concert from Dublin of a Smashing Pumpkins concert. What would such a thing do for time and space if the whole culture had it? Would it erase geography? Would it obviate it? Would it matter anymore where you were born, where you lived, where things happened in 3D space, if more and more of the world seemed to happen online? The other thing I noticed, more or less immediately, the reason I fell in love with the internet is the best place in the world to find people to tell them they're wrong about. If you love to tell people they're wrong, if you're a budding newspaper columnist who loves to argue with people, the internet is to you what South Africa's mines were to the British. It's just this irresistible, bottomless seam of argument. And, you know, look at me. Do I look like I should be fighting with anyone? Not in the real world. But that was the thrill of the internet. On the internet, no one knows you're a dog. On the internet, no one knows you're not a 6'3" Dutch powerlifter. On the internet, it doesn't matter if you're just 5'6" and clearly very conscious about it. On the internet, you could be anyone. And if you wanted to be this like know-it-all intellectual combatant, you could. When I went online, I was a different person. When I got on the internet, I discovered that I liked writing. I was good at writing, and I was good at using writing to argue about stuff in this new medium, and that I was good at learning the dynamic of online discussion. And I really loved it. It was a thrilling place. None of this has changed, by the way. I still love to argue. I'm a columnist for a big newspaper that influential people read, but I still will see someone say something on Nextdoor and just go crazy with fighting. Someone will say we shouldn't build more housing or some other crazy thing like that, and then I'll waste half the Saturday afternoon fighting with them. People are wrong on the internet. You have to stop it. So, what happened? I'm describing the internet as this dreamland of free thought, of open debate, this place where people from different geographies came together, find common cause, a place where everyone could be and feel like an immigrant. Is this anything like the internet you know today? How many new perspectives did you see online? How many people changed your mind? If you think back to yesterday and imagine that you had the same day 20 years ago, would the outcome have been any different, or is it just things are more convenient? You'd have had to use a landline phone, and you wouldn't have been able to see beach photos from your high school guidance counselor, pictures that you really could have done without. But beyond the convenience, do you really think the internet has changed, has increased kind of enlightenment in the world? I would say no, mostly no. I would venture that there's a good possibility that the opposite has happened, that something you saw on your phone only hardened your certainty. How wrong is it possible to be about? When I left college, having worked at my college newspaper, I moved to San Francisco to cover the internet because I thought it would become this force of radical openness in the world. As an immigrant from a country defined by all these arbitrary distinctions among people, an immigrant hyper attuned to the invisible power that geography had over minds, I had gone to cover the internet because I thought it could do for the world something like what immigration had done. So, what went wrong? Why is the internet of today not that force of open? Why did I start this talk promising to get around to my favorite subject of how technology is undoing the world, how we should prepare for the end of it? Why did the internet turn out? The short answer, there's sort of several short answers. Because of money, because of human nature, because the world is complicated, because nothing works out like the way you thought it would when you were 16. In the early 2000s, I was in San Francisco covering an internet that had then been left for dead by much of the world after the dot-com boom. I left college and I went to work at Wired, which was the tech magazine that in the early days defined online culture. Then I went to work at Salon, which is a magazine born on the internet. It never existed in print. It was a thing entirely online. And it was there that I began to realize, oh, actually, this is not the machine, the system of openness you thought it would be. This could work out completely different. I'd begun to notice it in little ways. The United States had just invaded Iraq, and the war was messy and complicated. Things weren't going well for this superpower that invaded. Happening today, the locals were putting up much more resistance than we thought. Pictures began emerging from the battlefield. Pictures of battle, pictures of war, and they were hard to believe. And I don't mean they were shocking. Some were shocking. But I mean more literally, who knows whether you should be shocked by the pictures, because who knew if you could believe them? Were they authentic? Did they reflect the world accurately? This really was hit home for me when I saw there was a picture of two American soldiers and an Iraqi boy. And the boy was holding up a sign that said something like, "Thank USA for saving my dad and sister." It was a nice picture, heartwarming, I guess. Americans are doing good. Except there was also another version of the photo also floating around online. Same two soldiers, same boy, but this time the sign said something like, "Thank you, America, for killing my dad and raping my sister." So what is this? Did the two American troops trick a little boy into holding a sign he didn't understand? Did they really kill his dad? Was the first sign accurate? It was hard to find out. No one knew. I asked experts about it. It was very difficult to figure out which was the real photo. I think in the end we determined that neither photo. More such images began to appear. In the early years after the 9/11 attack, there were some cranks who insisted that it was not an attack by Al-Qaeda, that it was an inside job, but it was not a widespread conspiracy. But by 1994, the cranks had morphed into an entire online community. There was marketing. There was an underground movie going around called Loose Change, a feature-length documentary using dozens of photos and videos from the scene that day, from the scene on 9/11. All these images, some that we knew were authentic images, news photos, some without context, you had no idea where they were. And they were all being used to make this case that 9/11 was an inside job. And the movie became a sensation. And the polling on 9/11 and whether people thought, the official story was real, the polls materially changed. And so I began to get worried. I began to change my mind. In the mid-2000s, I wrote a book about all this, about how the internet was, rather than enlightening us, how it was creating these echo chambers and cliques online, and how those groups were pushing falsehoods that were altering the real world. It was called True Enough, Learning to Live in a Post-Fact Society, and it was published just before Obama's election. And then the phenomenon that I'd written about just went into overdrive. This washed-up TV show host and a failed hotel magnate, a man named Donald Trump, he came out of nowhere to question whether Obama was an American. And you know what? People believed him. The polling, again, actually changed after he was elected. On the question of whether people thought Obama was American or not, the numbers for they didn't think he was American kept going up over his first term. In the late 2000s, I worked at another magazine born on the web, Slate. This is when smartphones were taking over, when Facebook was becoming inescapable, or Instagram began to take hold of the culture. This is when Netflix began to become more than just a DVD service. And then I noticed that it wasn't just the internet changing the world by itself. It wasn't that the internet was narrowing our ideas about the world on its own. I mean, there was also things like Fox News. So why not just blame TV also? But then I spent much of the 2010s as a journalist on Twitter, the online clubhouse where journalists are kind of like mini celebrities, and where all these in-groups fight to get attention for their cause. And I noticed something really unsettling there. what I noticed was happening was that what was on Twitter in the afternoon would be on Fox News at night. And then it would make its way to, the Fox News clip would make its way to YouTube the next morning. And then that would go on Facebook and filter out to the world over the next. It was just a big system. There wasn't an online and offline anymore. There was just this one big stream that connected all these media. And whether you were on one team or another was determined by where on the stream you fished for your news, your world. And then here's where money entered. Remember how I said that fighting online was really irresistible? There was something to that. There is something addictive about outrage, about your group dunking on another group. It was irresistible. And then people noticed that it could be monetized, it could be mined, it could be studied algorithmically. And what was determined from algorithmic study could be used to build a profile of you. And advertising could be sold against the profile. Outrage fed engagement, and engagement fed revenue. Revenue fed Mark Zuckerberg's endless land in Hawaii. And then there was human nature. I had underestimated human nature. I had misjudged how people would be. And I shouldn't have, really. I grew up in South Africa where people's entire worldview was determined by these racial buckets. That's very kind of terribly classic human nature way people believe, to divide. And for some reason, I didn't think I didn't occur to me that that would happen on the internet. I thought the internet would let people soar above provincialism. Now, I wasn't the only one. Mark Zuckerberg, in his investor letter taking Facebook public, what's known as the S1 in the IPO, in 2012, Zuckerberg wrote, "Facebook is not a business." He described Facebook as more like a movement, like a social force, like a machine for connecting the world. And connection, the implication was unambiguously good. And that had been my thinking too. That was what I'd pictured the internet would be as a teenager in the 1990s. Now, Zuckerberg was saying this in 2012 when he should have known better. And maybe he did know better, but he was about to become one of the world's richest men, so he didn't dwell on what had been obvious. But connecting people is not always good. First of all, good is kind of meaningless because good just whatever you like. But for whatever your definition of good, connecting people obviously can't lead only to that. What if your political opponents? What if their connections make them a more powerful? What if that powerful force has a mouthpiece on a large social network? What if that social network happens to be a hangout for a cable news producer? What if those cable news producers mistake what's happening on that social network for reality, and then on the cable networks broadcast what was on the social networks as reality? Then what's reality? And then also, the kind of most scary thing, what if governments get involved in how people connect with one another? In the earliest days of the internet, one of the fantasies that people had was it would become this government-free zone. That the online world, cyberspace, would become a place ungovernable by old world power. There was one of the early kind of internet philosophers was John Perry Barlow, who was one of the members of Grateful Dead, or kind of toured with them, I think. And he wrote a Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. And basically it said, it was kind of a message to the governments of the world saying that they had no power on the internet. They were not welcome, that the laws of the real world did not apply to this new network. That idea lasted approximately 5 years. As soon as governments understood the power of the internet, they began to co-opt it, to surveil it, troll it. We learned about this here in the United States when Edward Snowden leaked a huge cache of documents that showed that the United States government had turned the internet into a sort of global spying device, unprecedented in its intrusiveness into regular. But then we began to see it elsewhere in much more dangerous ways, and how other governments began to use the internet to even scarier political. In China, for instance, in 2000, when Bill Clinton normalized trade relations, he argued that doing business with China would open it up to American technology and American capitalism, and that once American technology and capitalism filtered through Chinese society, communist government there would lose its grip on society. That the Chinese government wouldn't be able to survive the internet would show the Chinese people what the world was like outside, and the Chinese government wouldn't be able to stop it. It was like Napster with the music industry. The music industry had this silly notion that on its own it could own songs and control them, and the Chinese government had this silly idea that it could control its own citizens' thoughts. But that wouldn't really be possible with the internet, would it? That's what Bill Clinton thought. That's what Americans thought generally, policymakers and others, in 2000. But the early internet people were wrong about that. I remember reading once that the Stasi, the secret police that terrorized the communist Soviet East Germany, they had to employ 10,000 tipsters to keep tabs on East German society. It took a lot of manpower to run this deadly secret police, but not with computers. Instead of quashing the authoritarian governments, instead of quashing the control that authoritarian governments hold over people, instead of weakening their control, what actually happened was the internet made it a lot easier to run a dictatorship. It made propaganda a lot easier. It made controlling a message a lot easier. It made censorship a lot easier. In China, the New York Times is blocked. It's been blocked for a long time. If we were just in the newspaper days, they would be able to block the newspaper, print copies of the newspaper, but there's lots of copies. One would get out, maybe people would copy them. You could censor it, but it was leaked. What the Chinese government does now is they tell Apple not to put the New York Times out. So Apple complies, because Apple really has to follow what the Chinese government says because they make their phones there and it's a big market. And so this is a much more powerful way to censor the news. It's a lot more efficient and effective. Instead of kind of collecting all the print copies of the New York Times and burning them or whatever, this is just like breaking the printing press. It's just preventing the paper from being, the news from being published at all. And people can get around it, but for most people, for ordinary people in China, there's a finality to it. They are prevented from getting information in a way that they wouldn't have been before. And this whole thing keeps getting worse. Facebook is spending billions to moderate its service, to make it less disruptive to democracy, to clean the place up. But it can't seem to win. Because if it wants to make money from advertising, it has to keep engagement. And it can't afford to kick everyone off because they have to say something other people like. And so what happened? Years after Facebook began policing its site and working to quash extremist content, what happened was hundreds of people who have been arrested for storming the Capitol on January 6th turned out to have planned all that they did on Facebook, to have warned and celebrated the attack on this social network before it happened. Some of them have even claimed since then to have been brainwashed. In court, some of the January 6th defendants have been claiming that the internet, Trump, QAnon, the online community, that they had been radicalized. They had not come to the internet and become kind of intellectual immigrants the way I had. They had come to the internet and become intellectual nationalists. They had become extremists. Now Facebook is called Meta, or the metaverse, which is this idea that we're going to move Facebook to virtual reality. I have a lot to say about virtual reality that I won't go into right now. We can talk about it in the questions. But what frightens me about it is the danger that virtual reality will be exactly like the internet today, except even more believable, even more convincing, even more real, and more of a force toward insular thinking and provincialism. I don't only write about social networks undermining democracy. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about climate change and electric cars and urbanism. I also think about artificial intelligence. But what I have to keep in mind always thinking about this is that there's a high likelihood I'm wrong and that things could turn out way worse than I suspect, and that I should be open to how badly they may. And so that's why I think a lot about about the end of the world these days. It's not, it's not likely that the internet would lead to the end of the world, but nobody thought that Facebook would be part of a genocide in Myanmar. Nobody thought that people would coordinate online and attack the Capitol. Nobody thought Donald Trump could become. All these things happen because the way that we communicate with each other has changed in this fundamental way, and the world has become very messy. And no one really understands, not even the people at Facebook, not even the people who run the system, not even the people who are making money, really understand how it works. And so I guess on that cheery note, I'm happy to take questions. It's a kind of a dispiriting way to end, but it's accurate. It's accurate in how in describing how I think about it, which is I'm a lot more wary of it, and I'm a lot more accepting of changing more slowly. I think one of the things we did wrong with, and this particularly happened with art, is that it became, instead of a tool, it became part of the infrastructure of our society. It became kind of how we do everything. Everyone sort of everyone sort of thinks of their smartphone as the way you think about your car, the key way to navigate society, and a thing that if you didn't have, you really couldn't participate. And it's fine that we made that decision, but I think we didn't really make that decision. We didn't, over a period of 3 or 4 years, no one had the iPhone, and then everyone had. And then that decision was sort of made for. And that's what I worry about happening with other, that we won't have any moment to reflect on how these things may change the world in ways that we don't expect. And that there's no one in the technology industry, and there's no incentive for a lot of people to think about those dangers. And so that's what I try to do as a columnist at the New York Times. I really try to think about the worst things that could happen and try to warn about them. I've become a lot less optimistic covering the internet, but I think that's the proper stance to have now. I think that the kind of optimism that people had in the early days of the was had gone to. And so the one thing that I could say that is kind of a positive is that I think a lot of people think more realistically about it. And so that's the one. All right, thanks. Thank you.
Hi. Sorry about that. First, I just want to thank you so much for really fascinating talk.
Thank you.
And rather than me responding, I thought to see who has.
Okay, so first, you're completely wrong. No, as someone who started out trying to oppose the war in Vietnam with a hand-crank mimeograph and then an electric, wow. I think the battle is the same. It's the battle over the, it just, I mean, the people who were for the war had free channels, all the newspapers, the New York Times and everything. But the reality crashed through that, and people found a way around that big imbalance of power. And I think the internet, I mean, have a little group, and we couldn't even exist without, and we're fighting an oil refinery. It does give the people who are trying to question a lot of tools that we didn't have before. And it's very natural that the people who want to keep things the way they are, are
Also
going to
use
try to
digital.
take it over and commercialize it. They try to make Paso a product. So I think we should expect that I'm more optimistic in that I think people will keep in this new battleground fighting it over the powers.
I hope you're right. I mean, I think that there have been lots of positive social movements that have started online. I just think that the balance between positive social movements and kind of really terrible in the wrong way.
You. What a superb storyteller you are. Thank you so much
thank
for
you.
that art. Amazing. There's some of us at age, but my revolt for reality is to turn it off and to focus on, I think, murder a day in Long Beach, affordable housing, really. And isn't that the kind of revolt to get from virtual reality to reality and the price of gas, price of milk? Everything else that seems to be happening in the World Wide Web seems unreal. So there seems to be a movement like Austin, Seattle. I was never, I don't even know, really, Instagram actually. So you see that as kind of a movement? Is it going to die?
No, one thing that I've written about a lot is YIMBYs, who are Yes in My Backyard, kind of movement against people who don't want to build more housing, who are known as YIMBYs. One of the difficulties that YIMBYs had for a while was that no one would show up to city council meetings, and the YIMBYs were very powerful. And when the pandemic happened and city council meetings went online, it allowed many, many more people to go. And what you had then was, in some ways, people who hadn't been activists before really had this place in it, in local decisions. But then you also had people who, didn't science, really yelling at public health officials, public health quit, threatened. And so, it sometimes, will lead to people who hadn't been organized before getting a chance to be organized. But it will also lead to, I guess, what we call like bad actors, exercising powers that, that are dangerous.
I would submit that your view of the internet seems to be somewhat dystopian, if I may use the fashionable word. I don't know if it's appropriate, but I'm just using it.
I think that's right.
I would submit that maybe there was some good that came out of the internet because it leveled the playing field. I know it did for people in India, for my colleagues, myself, many people who had no access to books, who couldn't afford books, things like that. Now there's a free playing field. So I'd like to comment on that. And the other comment I have is that perhaps the internet is not that it should have been and has been subject to manipulation because it's not decentralized enough. Maybe it needs to be decentralized, and this little gadget here, controlled by various network monopolies, are going to become obsolete because we have brought we can stop. So how would you,
On the second
would you
part,
please comment on that?
I think that decentralization in kind of different forms, in kind of technologically, but also, in how politics manages business and like anti-monopoly, I think that would help a lot. A huge problem that we have is we have 3 or 4 companies that are controlled by insiders at the companies, kind of deciding speech policies for the entire world. And that seems, wrong in all kinds of ways. And that may be happening. European governments are pushing for kind of various antitrust rules. The Biden administration may be tougher on that than the Trump administration was. So I'm hopeful about that. The first thing you said about the internet giving us access to all of this knowledge we didn't have before, and it's free, kind of available to no access. I think that's true. I think that's true personally. Like, just everything that I do now, fixing things in the house, articles, just like I look on the internet, I've understood. And if you think about kind of all the knowledge that's being accumulated that way, it's awesome. The problem is that the internet is also, in addition to giving us all of this great knowledge, it also very easily lets us ignore great. And so it gives you this access to this entire cornucopia of information, but it also makes you get the information like a little straw, and so you don't get, and it's very difficult to get a broad view. I think that's the difficulty. Yeah, Wikipedia is one of the examples of the internet really working well.
Hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. Could you share your thoughts about the challenge that we have with privacy knowledge?
Yeah. In some ways, I think the battle is lost because the big tech companies, especially Facebook and Google, just know so much about you that that if you want to be private now, even kind of not being a member of Facebook, even never signing up for a Google account, they still can know stuff about you. They still have profiles up about you. But it's one of those things that you could see being solved. Sometimes I think about it like pollution in the United States in the 70s, where there's all this pollution, and then we pass laws, and then over time, the air becomes. And there's all this private information that these companies have, and the information is only really valuable to them right now. If you sort of make it more difficult to collect private information, you, at some point, the thing that they have is too old, valuable. Perhaps the laws work. What we're actually seeing now, though, is that laws are less effective at protecting our privacy than Apple is. So Apple last year launched a feature in the iPhone that allows you to sort of opt out of being tracked by Google advertising. And this feature has been tremendously popular and very bad. Facebook said that this year they were Their revenue would be down $10 billion because of it. And so it's really interesting to think about how one monopoly uses its monopoly power to protect customers who pay a lot to that company from another monopoly collecting their private information. In some sense, Apple is being, really good to people there, but it's also in their business interest, and it also depends on them really controlling a large part of life. So I've had trouble thinking about whether I like it.
Hello? Hi. Earlier you talked about Facebook getting verified or people using Facebook images.
Yeah, so in the country that used to be called Burma, in 2016, 17, there was this kind of orgy of killing of an ethnic minority called the Rohingya. And there's just a lot of documented stories, information about many of the massacres happening because of local leaders or local officials of various kinds spreading rumors on Facebook, and Facebook's algorithms broadcasting them, and the messages kind of go viral. And do you blame Facebook for that? In Rwanda in the 90s, they used radio for similar things, but it's different because Facebook is like this for-profit company that is managing an internet service in a country where it has no human record. I think it put people there after the genocide, but at the time it didn't. And so this was happening, and Facebook really had the ability to stop it, but just had no capacity to stop it. And I think that's one of the dangers of a company run by people in California that has people all over the world using their service, and they don't really understand the culture, and they don't really understand. I think they didn't even have people who spoke the language, and so didn't really have a sense of what was happening on the internet there. And then you can imagine this happening, this sort of thing, perhaps not genocide, but just this sort of social unrest happening in many parts of the world, and Facebook really having no idea.
I'm kind of sorry I didn't ask much earlier after all these heavy, more of a personal thing about the backstory. I'm surprised you were surprised at how the internet played out. But didn't you also read any William Gibson?
Yeah, I mean,
Any Philip K. Dick?
in general, like science fiction has been.
Even H.G. Wells predictions of that.
Yeah, I think science fiction has been and remains kind of a really good way to think about. I was caught up in the frenzy of things. Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. Yeah. Yeah.
Question.
Yes.
Hi. Well, first, I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And I'm a very big fan of your work.
Thanks.
Thank you. So I teach internet regulation here at Cal State Long Beach. And one of the things we talk a lot about is how we should regulate speech online. And you referenced the fact that there are about a handful of companies that now determine our online speech policies. And the alternative to that basically is to repeal or revise and have government, which is problematic in a whole slew of other ways. So what do you think is the solution there, if there is a solution, and is there a balance? We don't want Facebook, Meta, Twitter determining what's online.
Yeah. Right. So it really does bother me that that Facebook has so much power over the way that people think and the news that people get. But it would bother me a lot more, United States. And I really oppose any any kind of haphazard way of changing 30. First of all, everything that I've kind of read or experts I've talked to suggests that even if we change Section 230, we have the First Amendment, and the First Amendment makes it very difficult for the government to tell Facebook to manage its service in a certain way, or broadcast or not broadcast certain speech. So I don't even know if it's legally possible here in the United States. But it bothers me that other countries in Europe, they have, I think they're moving toward a system where the government has a lot of say in how the internet works. And I think that just could lead to even more. How do you solve that? I mean, I think that you work toward and hope for a kind of decentralization. But I'm not, I think the hardest thing I write about and think about is this topic, internet moderation, because it's really, really important. It's really important how the world works, but no one has thought of a good way of doing it. And the kind of options we have are, people who own these companies doing it, or stopping the people who own these companies from doing it. Both of those just are it's hard to know which poison. So I guess I'm saying I don't have an answer. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I spend a lot of time thinking about the intersection of climate, environment, tech, and about the material footprint of cloud. That it's very much centered in data centers, all of heavy, more electricity than many trees, right? World, as well as water, and accelerating climate crisis. Metaverse. The metaverse is going to take off. Cool so far, but and just curious what you kind of think about trying to mitigate climate change, and at the same time, the data has to go all of tools. I would argue accelerating is anyway. That environment. That's what I'm think about the impact of tech, trying to greenwash.
Yeah, crypto is just terrible for the environment in staggering ways, and it's especially terrible if you think that if you think they're using all this electricity to kind of replicate currencies, replicate financial. I don't think I'm not as I guess I'm not as pessimistic about it as you may be. One thing that I think is really I don't know, I'm really optimistic about is solar power and the advances of in technology, and the way that technology is dramatically reducing the cost of improving. Solar power is now the cheapest way to make electricity, and it's getting even cheaper. We used to think that we needed laws to stop coal production, but it seems like economically coal production is not going to be viable anymore because of cheap solar. And so in that way, I think that it could be really powerful. But then there are other ways where technology is helping a little bit, but not in as big of a way as it could. So it's great that we're going to get electric cars, because electric cars are more efficient than gas-powered cars, but they're still cars, and they come with a lot of problems that cars have, and space and killing people, and the cost of building them, the environmental cost of building them, the difficulties of obtaining the raw materials, and I worry that some people would see that as kind of like panacea, like we got Tesla, good. So I worry that Tesla, like, the electric car will be like the end state of what we do in transport, to make it more environment. I worry about that. But I think I think there are real ways where technology is, making that problem easier.
Farhad, numerous times I had an opportunity to listen to you on CNBC. You are a very well sought out person for your opinion. And second, I agree with the young lady that you are a good storyteller. So keep it up. Congratulations. It's a nice meeting you in person. Internet security is the paramount important to all of us. What are the recent advances are taking place for the internet security? And the second question, you personally, because there's so much garbage on the internet, and just to pick out a right is like from needle in the haystack. What things you do personally? When I'm sure you are very active on the internet, so how you wean out the right piece? Thank you.
Yeah. So the first question on internet security, I wish I had more knowledge about it. It's not really a thing that I follow or study beyond like figuring out how to keep my own data secure. At the New York Times, we have a very kind of complicated internet security program, but I always constantly worry that everything another. So it's something that I personally worry about a lot, but I don't really have any. Where I get my news and how I kind of navigate. Best way that I figured out how to do it is spend all of your time reading the Neglect your kids, don't pay attention to anything else in life, just spend your time reading the internet, and eventually you will sort of learn the signs of accurate information. Now, of course, I don't really mean that, but like it's my job to sort out information, and hopefully, if we're doing our job correctly at the New York Times, you can buy a subscription to the Times, and you will be well informed about the world, and you won't have to read everything else. But I think that one of the things that I learned is that in sort of from about 2000, from about the late 90s to about 2012 or so, people had this idea that there would be lots and lots of different credible sources online. And really, I think now I believe things published in like if it's published in the New York Times or like similar peer news organizations, then I will take it more credibly. And everything else I sort of doubt until I verify more than. And the whole idea of like having lots of credible sources online, I don't know if we can do it. Like, I don't know if it's viable in a world where just everyone gets to choose what. So I've really gone back to kind of like the old model of you believe these four things. I believe what I hear on NPR, I believe what I read in the New York. Sound like a very old person. What I do.
I think it's probably maybe not well known enough. The tech elite are probably the most aggressive and the most active at restricting access to the internet and technology for children. So I'm curious, as a parent, how you approach technology at home and educate your children and what access you have. And
I had a lot of rules and kind of strong feelings about it before the pandemic. And then my kids were at home, and then I realized that the entire concept of screen time was kind of categorical because they were using screens to do school, and it suggested that like using screens was not per se bad, and so it's made managing their technology and what they do with technology a lot. I think it was true. I'm not really sure if it is true anymore that the tech elite, prevented their kids from using the internet I think that the pandemic really changed a lot of ideas about kids in the my rules about the internet for my kids now is they are allowed limited access to YouTube on the weekends, and most other and they have like rules about the amount of time they can use their devices, but I don't really have more kind of content. And I also think about how when I was a kid, I just really felt like enlightened by things that I learned on the internet, like, and I kind of want them to figure things out also. So I'm not for a lot of restrictions that I have. Yeah.
Well, now question two. There's a lot of educators in the room, and I was thinking about what do you need us to do to educate your kids to navigate the internet?
I think it's just the basic stuff of like critical thinking about sources, critical thinking about like teaching skills that allow people to figure out the validity of a statement, and that has nothing to do with technology. You know, it applies to what you read in a book, and it applies to what you watch on TV and what you get from the internet. And really, like, because what happens on the internet now is what we talk about on TV, and everything is kind of mixed. I think we just have to approach society with, you know, just a much more critical eye. And I think that if you're teaching kids about navigating that world, just that kind of common sense things. There is a group, I don't know if you know it, and I can't think of it off the top of my head. There's a research group at a university that has like a method for figuring out, for teaching kids to figure out to navigate the internet. And I thought that was very useful, and I wish I could remember it right now, but I'll see you later. That's interesting, yeah.
Hi, Mr. Manju. Thanks so much for coming to CSULB. I read the New York Times once in a while, and I'm really fascinated by some of your columns. First up, I'm trying my very best to rely less on Twitter, spend less time on Twitter, and spend more time, you know, critically thinking when I check out different news sources. In the words of Piers Morgan, it's best to be positive and critical of someone or something instead of a sheep who blindly follows someone or something. Anyway, my question is, I agree with you on the metaverse and how it's becoming more dangerous and worse than the internet. In fact, you know, I always say no thanks every time I see Meta's ads for MetaQuest and its other metaverse products. First up, do you view the California Consumer Privacy Act that we have right here in California as a good stepping stone on the road to reining in big tech, or could it be a barrier? Second, are there any possible ways to rein in the metaverse, and which regulations do you support that would rein in big tech? I know you're not a fan of some of them. Thank you.
The California Privacy Act, I think, has been useful, but it's difficult to say so far. One of the things that happened with it is that it was a strong bill, and then it kind of got watered down and lobbied down by the tech companies, and so it's less strong. And I don't really know if it has had a huge real-world effect, but I appreciate them. And I think, like, in general, internet regulation is going to happen kind of stepwise. You pass a rule, see how the rule works, and you then, you know, adjust. Regulations about the metaverse, I don't know. The metaverse is not a thing. Like, it's a thing in Facebook ads, and what Facebook's idea of it is you put on Facebook's virtual reality system, and then you're in the metaverse. But is that the metaverse, or is it just Facebook reality? So maybe we ought to have regulations for virtual reality or metaverse, but I feel like we need to wait until that. What regulations do I support about reining in big tech? I really think that the most kind of useful thing is various kinds of anti-monopoly efforts. Like if Facebook didn't also own Instagram, it would be a lot less powerful company and a lot less. It would have the capacity to do a lot of damage. And it's really one of the worst things that the Obama administration did was just do nothing. From about 2008 to about 2012, you really saw this kind of move toward monopoly. There were lots of internet companies, and then there were people. And it happened because the Justice Department and the FTC under the Obama administration didn't stop several mergers. They allowed Facebook to buy Instagram and WhatsApp. They allowed Google to buy everything. And I think that in some ways, like the horse has left the barn there. Like maybe you could split up those companies, but it's not going to have the same effect that it would have had before if you hadn't. I think that if we think about future technology, I feel like thinking about like concentration of power, just monopolies in general, and trying to prevent really important.
You know, fortunately, our time is really. So I'm just going to say one more question. So, thank you.
Hello. So I have two questions for you. One is regarding the profiling and advertising. For example, you discuss with anything, with your friends on WhatsApp. The next day you see the same sort of advertisements on Facebook, Instagram. That is one. And second thing is the monopoly, basically. We give a lot of information on the net. Like we use maps. We give how many people are present in a bus you are traveling in. The kind of data that you feed into the net. But at the same time, if you want to access the same information, you post videos on YouTube. But if you want to watch the same videos, then you definitely have to go through that long process of, 10-15 seconds of, 2 advertisements. So the thing is, if you are going to make companies like Google, YouTube into monopolies, so what is the stand that we have to take as individuals? So is there anything that we can do about it, or should government step in, or what could be the best solution to handle these sort of situations?
I don't think there's a lot you can do about it as an individual. I mean, it's possible to not use products from the big tech companies, but it's very difficult to kind of live your life that way because of the kind of importance they have in our lives. Like, it's very difficult. It would be very difficult to kind of function for some people to just not use YouTube, Google. You don't want to use a lot of Google products. There are alternatives to Google as a search engine. You can use other search, but there's not really another YouTube. There's not really another Instagram. And so I really think that it's like the government's role to have. I'm sorry, what was your question? Yeah. It's really creepy, isn't it? It's sometimes I wonder if I had an independent thought about something, or if just am interested in that because I saw it. Like if we're thinking about going on a vacation, and then I search up that location, and then 2 days later I see an ad for a hotel there, Facebook. And then I go to the hotel. Did I go to the hotel because Facebook told me that I went to the hotel? And like, what do I think about that I didn't really kind of independently have that? What you can do about it is limited, but you can do things about it. I mean, there are ways to stop Facebook from collecting as much, or sort of profiling as much, and keeping as much about you. You can also, I think at this point, it's relatively easy to go to kind of operate in the world and not use Facebook. Like it's more difficult to not use Google, and it's more difficult to not use YouTube. But I think Facebook is like something that people can live without at this point. And it's surprising because you know, just a few years ago, it seemed like Facebook was going to be inescapable. But now I think, you know, for a lot of people, Instagram seems inescapable and Facebook seems something you live without. But for a lot of people, WhatsApp is inescapable. You know, if you have family elsewhere in the world, WhatsApp connects you with them in this very intimate way. You kind of feel like you live there. You're in their lives. And you can't really. And what you talk about there, you will see ads on it. There's just not a lot you can do.
On that very cheery note, thank you.
Thanks
It
so
was
much.
a really fabulous talk.
Thanks. What? Ah, see? I should probably turn this off. Yeah. Never trust what you read on the internet.
Exactly what you were talking about.
Hi. I'm just going to turn off this.